Joining me now is Shaniqua McClendon, Vice President of Political Strategy at Crooked Media, along with former Florida Representative and MSNBC political analyst Carlos Curbelo. Welcome to you both. Bernie Sanders makes a pretty strong case there, Shaniqua. Should Biden issue these preemptive pardons? Do you think he'll do it?
Yeah, not only is it smart, it's absolutely necessary. Donald Trump has not minced words about what he wants to do. And I think anyone who's pretending that Trump's second term will be one of civility and level-headedness is just being dishonest with themselves and whoever that they're trying to convince of that. I also think generally, Democrats need to get more comfortable with power and using power. And President Biden has an opportunity now to set an example for Democrats across the country at every level of government to use every bit of power they have to make sure that Donald Trump and all these billionaire friends that he's brought, into his administration directly or indirectly to make sure that they don't make this country worse than it was. And the last thing I'll say is, a lot of the pushback on President Biden even issuing these pardons is, that Donald Trump might take his cues from him. Donald Trump doesn't take cues from Democrats, and we have to stop making decisions based on how Republicans might respond to us.
Interesting point there. So Senator Sanders was asked about FBI Director Christopher Wray's decision to resign years before his end of term, rather than giving Trump a chance to fire him. Sanders said he was nervous about that. Was it the right decision? Should Wray have forced Trump to fire him, or his resignation? Does it protect the institution?
Alex, I think it was the right decision. I mean, the FBI director serves at the pleasure of the president, even though there's this tradition of the 10-year terms. It's certainly the president's prerogative whether to keep an FBI director or not. And clearly, Director Wray does not have the confidence of the president. We can debate that and debate whether or not he should. After all, he was Donald Trump's appointee from last time he was in office. And clearly, President Biden did respect that tradition. But to serve in such an important role without having the confidence of the president is difficult. So I think he made the right move. And look, I think just briefly on this pardons issue, I don't think these Jan 6 committee members should accept pardons. They didn't do anything wrong. And I think by going ahead and accepting a pardon, that's kind of playing into Donald Trump's hands, saying, well, yeah, you probably did something wrong, which is why you took a pardon. So I think if we really trust our institutions, we let this play out. And if he wants to try to accuse them and charge them of something, let the court sort that out. I think it would get thrown out immediately.
So, Shaniqua, my colleague Jen Psaki wrote about the surprisingly little pushback that Kash Patel has gotten as the potential new head of the FBI. She says, quote, for a party that once prided itself on supporting law enforcement, the GOP's embrace of Patel's extremist leadership style reveals how far Republicans are willing to go to undermine institutions in service of Donald Trump. Will Patel really just sail through confirmation? And is there any real way to protect institutions before that happens with Patel or anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the fear that a lot of people have. We're supposed to have checks and balances. We're supposed to have institutions that make sure things like this can't happen, that make sure that someone like Kash Patel, who has made it really clear who he's going to go after, doesn't have the ability to do this. But one of those checks is supposed to be our Senate. And what we're seeing now from Senate Republicans is that they are afraid. I mentioned this before. They had an opportunity to convict Donald Trump the 2 times he was impeached, and they didn't do that. And so now, you're seeing a lot of Senate Republicans just kind of throw their hands up and let Donald Trump make all these decisions. And operating from fear is not, being a leader. So I think what we're seeing is they're afraid of him. And that is why someone like Kash Patel might actually get through, despite us supposed to having, these checks in place to prevent someone like him from being in that position.
I just want to be clear. When you say they're afraid of him, you think they're afraid that he'll just come after them as individuals, try to make life uncomfortable, get them primaried if they're up for election in another couple of years, that kind of thing?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think those things that, you shouldn't be afraid of losing an election. I do think that's part of it. But I also think that they see the comments that he's making about someone like Liz Cheney, about the people who were on the January 6th committee. It would be nice to think that our checks and balances would protect those people. But going back to the pardons, the reason I think President Biden should issue them is because I'm losing confidence in those protections because of some of the people like Republican senators who are just not doing their jobs.
Carlos, let's talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's certainly coming under fire after his lawyer, someone who's advising him, asked the FDA to revoke approval of the polio vaccine. His spokesman responded by saying the vaccine should be available to the public and thoroughly and properly studied. USA Today posted a satirical op-ed from the point of view of polio supporting RFK Jr.'s nomination, and it reads, "This is exactly the kind of person whom I and those who've signed on to this letter, including measles, mumps, rubella, influenza, and of course natural selection, would like to see in charge of America's health." I mean, all the talk about this, that kind of an op-ed, can he really overcome concerns about these serious health issues?
Well, I think what you're going to see, Alex, is in his confirmation hearing, senator after senator trying to get him on the record with exactly what he plans to do about vaccines. And look, in the Senate, you have a very prominent polio survivor in Mitch McConnell. Look for him to be a swing vote when it comes to RFK. If RFK does not reassure a sufficient number of senators that he is going to respect vaccine policy in this country, that he's not going to undermine a policy that has clearly had many successes, then he might struggle to get the 50 votes he will need to get confirmed. So look for senators to press him very hard on that issue. And I'm talking about senators from both parties.
Okay. Thank you guys so much, Shaniqua and Carlos. Good to see you.